This is the second part of session number 2. I will be talking about the external part of the building. This will be a continuation from where we stopped in the previous session. Now, in the previous session, I covered a number of areas to be attentive to when you do an inspection or when you view a property. I talked about the roof. I talked about chimney. I also talked about the rainwater pipes, and I talked about the porches, or the porch and conservatory. I also went as far as addressing fences and boundary walls. But the one area that I did not mention, which I intentionally left out, was the wall, the external wall. And that will be the focus of today's session. So today we're focusing on the outside of the building, and the intention is to equip you with sufficient understanding and insight, so that when you do a site viewing, when you do a property inspection, when you do an analysis of a property, you know what to look out for. The external wall, in my opinion, is probably the most important area to focus most of your attention on. I made reference to the fact that when you arrive to do an inspection, it's best to have a stopwatch. And the intention of this is that the stopwatch should be used as a way of guiding you, so you understand how much time you've spent observing, reviewing, and understanding the property in more detail. And I made reference to the fact that it was very, very essential to give yourself time. I said it was important to arrive 15, sometimes up to 25 minutes early. And this early, I mean before the agent, the sales agent, before they arrive. Sales agents, bless them, they have one purpose and one purpose alone, and that is to effect the sale. They are not looking out for your best interest. When you're purchasing a property, you must understand that it is your asset. The onus, the responsibility is on yourself. So it's best to arrive, in my opinion, the way I usually will try to do mine will be to arrive half an hour before, so I can observe, make inferences about the street, the neighborhood, and then more importantly the building. In talking about the external wall today, the first thing to pay attention to, assuming this to be your building and that to be your chimneys, we're going to focus on the external of the building. When you arrive for your viewing, I'd like you to start by asking the following questions, or making the following observations. Number 1, what type of construction? I will not go into the different types of construction for buildings. Normally, buildings are, from a structural or civil perspective, are rated in terms of types, whether it's load bearing, whether it's fire resistant, but I will not go into that detail. The most important thing for you is to understand what type. Externally, is it brick? Is it masonry? Is it stone? Now, in a lot of buildings in the UK, but particularly in London, you will find that most of the buildings are brick. Please forgive me. I wasn't aware that I was writing out of sight, or outside your field of view. The brick is the main type that you would find with most buildings. I'd like you to just observe the quality of the brick. In many cases, you will also find that there's some buildings that have what we call pebble dash, or they have what's called rough cast. Rough cast and pebble dash are used interchangeably. However, pebble dash is used more often. And where you have a brick, assuming this to be the internal of the building, you have a brick, maybe 225 brick. What tends to happen is you could also have a choice or decision made by the owner to put pebble dash on the front facade, so it covers the entire front of the building. So underneath the pebble dash is brick. Some other times you might find that what you might have is render. You might have render, so very, very nicely covering which hides the brick. So you might see a building that looks very, very, very nicely covered, and then it's painted. Underneath the render or the painting, usually you would find the brick. Sometimes people just paint over the brick directly. Now, I raise these items simply to make a point, which is nothing is ever as it first appears, with the exception of brick. So when you see a building that is rendered or has pebble dash, don't assume that that is the only composition or construction, and that is the actual construction. There's something underneath, something that resides behind. Now, I make reference to this because there are some buildings you would go to view and they look very, very unattractive on the outside. They might have pebble dash, or they may have been rendered. You might even find that there are cracks on the building. Do not be alarmed. And the reason is simply because the render can be removed and replaced, or it can be restored. The pebble dash can be removed and the brick exposed again. As a matter of fact, I have had occasions where buildings have sold at a significantly large discount to the building's value, simply because it was covered with pebble dash. Now, most people cover the facade, the brick, with pebble dash to hide, sometimes to hide a defect, or sometimes to prevent additional maintenance of the brickwork. So you have to be careful. Sometimes you might be buying something that is probably more defective. It's important to consult with a structural engineer before you make such decisions. I make reference to that because you can make a fortune if you understand what you're buying. In other words, you can find a building that has not been maintained on the outside. It has pebble dash, or it has render, but it's been so poorly maintained, it's been so terribly looked after, that it's unappealing to a lot of investors. And for that reason, sometimes it could be sold for a significant discount. And so all you would have to do is buy the property, get a very good specialist contractor to take down this pebble dash, to restore the brick. I'll cover that in a second. But what they simply do is they repoint, they clean, and then they restore the brick. And once you've done that, the property's value goes up drastically. So just standing in front of the building, just make some observation, make a note. Is it brick? Is it pebble dash? For Georgian houses, you tend to have scuto, which is usually, most times, is usually on the ground floor of a Georgian house. Just make an observation. Now, the next thing to bear in mind, and the reason I'm identifying all of this, let's assume that the building has some brick and the brick is exposed, I'd like you to just observe and see whether there are any cracks on the brick. Are there bricks that are cracked? Is it significant? Are the cracks continuous? Are they visible on different parts of the building? You might also notice that it needs the mortar which holds the brick is significantly damaged and may need replacing. Now, the reason you're making all these observations is because you want to understand a few things. When it comes to brick, you can either replace the broken or the damaged bricks. Once you've replaced, you need to do what's called repoint. This is where you take out all of what holds the brick together, and then you put the sealant back again so it looks very nice and neat. You might need to repoint. There are occasions where once you've done that, if it's an old building, you might need to clean. You might need to clean the brick or the facade. Doesn't matter what type of material it is. Sometimes the damage could be so much that you have to restore. So you have to do some restoration work, and this would include washing. This restoration could include washing, replacing, repointing, and then cleaning the brick. And finally, sometimes you may have to redecorate the facade. Now, this is the redecoration does not simply apply to the bricks. What you tend to find is with buildings, especially period buildings, what you tend to find is that with period buildings, some of the features are dated. So you might find that there's a window, and the window has some beautiful, let's imagine this to be the window. And the window has some beautiful decorations. These decorations maybe date all the way back to when the building was originally designed. So it has become part of a feature of the window. These windows have what we call a window trim. And this could be something like a feature. It's like a beautiful design feature, just to give the house a unique look. This would mean because the decoration is not part of the brick, it's fixed to the brick, it would mean that these features, the decoration, would need maintenance, would need replacing, would need restoration or removal. So you have to pay attention. It's not just about the window, it's usually about any decorations on the facade. Sometimes you might see buildings and they have beautifully designed decorations to make the building look unique. You could have a number, it's like 1854, and that makes the building, gives the building maybe the year when the building was constructed. You have to make an observation because someone will have to repair that if it's faulty. So having said that, let me explain to you why I think all of these are important. From my perspective, it all comes down to cost. Remember what I said at I believe it was the introduction session. One of the purpose of your viewing a property or doing an inspection is to understand the extent of additional costs that may be incurred once you've purchased the property. Let's use this as an example. Let's say you've found a building, it's beautiful, however, there are some bricks that need to be replaced. As a result of that, you will need to repoint, not just the sections that have been replaced, but also most of the mortar or most of the facade needs repointing. Let's assume it's also a building that has not been maintained very well. So it needs cleaning and some restoration work. And let's say some decoration, just like I explained about the windows. Now, why is this important? Let's just go back to numbers. You find a property that is worth 500,000. You negotiate for the purchase down to 400,000. Let's say you're using a loan from a bank or mortgage. You are getting a mortgage and you will be putting down your deposit. In this case, you're putting down a 10% deposit. The bank will give you 90% of the value of the house. So in this case, your deposit is 45,000 and the bank will give you 415,000. You may have bought this property well, and we'll assume that you bought well. But because you did not take the time to go through the items that I covered in the previous session, and because perhaps you were not aware of all of these nuances that are associated with purchasing a property. In the previous session, we talked about the fact that it could be possible that as a result of having to repair the chimney, if you remember, I guess you would have to go back to the previous session. I made reference to the fact that you may have to get a scaffold for this repairs to be done. And in the previous session, I identified that the cost for all of this works could be substantial. As a matter of fact, I said that to repair the chimney, assuming that it would cost you 10,000, assuming that to get the scaffold would cost you 4,000, I made reference to the fact that assuming that you have to replace, apologize, I believe this was meant to be the scaffold, this was meant to be the roof. I believe I talked about the chimney as about 2,000. And I made reference to the fact that let's assume that in total they cost you roughly 16,000. This is 16,000 just for the chimney and the roof. So it's a lot of money. But I didn't stop there. I also made reference to the fact that there was a possibility that there could be other costs. Now let's bring that additional cost into the equation. Let's say that because you were unaware, you bought the property. Now you bought the property, there are additional costs that you have to incur, or that will be incurred in the next 3 to 5 years. Let's bring in the cost of the wall. Now, to replace the bricks, repoint, let's assume you use the same contractor, do the cleaning, restoration. This could cost you something in the region of about 30,000 for all of that, depending on the extent of the works. For example, let me just give you a good example. If you want to repoint, this could cost you between 6,000 to 10,000. This includes the scaffold. If you're going to clean, just to clean alone could cost you between 3,000 and 5,000. If you're going to just do the restoration work, depending on the nature of the restoration work, assuming that you would already pay for the repointing, this could cost you roughly 4,000. If you were going to re-render, in other words, take down the existing render, this could cost you roughly about 4,000 to 5,000. Now, here is what's really important. If the building already has some pebble dash, and you wanted to remove the pebble dash and reinstall new pebble dash, or maintain the existing brick, to remove the pebble dash could cost you something in the region of about 10,000. Now, it all depends on the size of the building, but this 10,000 will be for roughly a 4-bedroom house. Doesn't matter whether you're buying just a flat. So if this is a 2-story building and you are buying just one, but the size of the building determines the extent of the pebble dash. So just looking at and adding up all of these numbers, you could easily be paying about 30,000. Now, if you add 30,000 to this 16,000 from the session from yesterday, is roughly 4 to 6,000. And this is before we've even looked into other areas, such as what I discussed yesterday when I made reference to the fact that you might have a porch that needs replacing, you might have fences that need replacing, you might have boundary walls that need replacing, you might have rainwater gutters and rainwater pipes that need replacing. So you very easily could find that you now need to expend an extra 4 to 6,000. Now, this means that what would have been a very good purchase has turned out to be a poor purchase. Why? Because this 4 to 6,000 represents 10% of the total purchase price. So suddenly you've gone from paying and buying well to overpaying for a property simply because you did not take into account the fact that there were additional works potentially that needed to be done. So just bear that in mind. It's important. Now, having discussed the wall, let me move very quickly and talk about the other parts of the external facade that I would like you to make or pay attention to. The second is the windows. This is quite easy. Look out for the type. Is it sash, traditional wood? Is it aluminum? What type of window is it? Make reference, pay attention to the type of window. Is the window single glazed? Is the window double glazed? Very important. Why? Because if it's single glazing, it would mean you would have to replace them once you've purchased them. If it's double glazed, it would mean that you would have to, you could in effect maintain or keep the existing windows. If there are sash windows, and if the area you're buying a property in is in a conservation area, there might be a necessity for you to replace all windows with the same original types. Now this could be quite expensive. The sash windows are normally more expensive than traditional aluminum windows. So you have to pay attention to the features. Sometimes you might find a sash window where the window has some very beautiful original design, and that's what makes the building stand out to you, right? This would mean when you come to replace this window, you would have to reinstall something quite similar if you are in a conservation area, or if the building is what we call a listed building. So effectively it means you cannot just replace wooden windows with aluminum windows, which are cheaper. The next thing I'd like you to make reference to is the window sill. So if you look at that as the external, imagine that's the window itself. Looking at it from the side, that's external, that's internal. There are times when, and this is the window, just imagine that. There are times when you have a sill that sticks out, or sometimes you might even have a frame that sticks out into the facade. And this is the brick. And you might have this frame or decoration. Or, like I mentioned previously, you might have what we call a trim, which is a design feature on a window. So this window, for example, could have a design feature, something like this. And that design feature could be in concrete, or it could be in wood. So you want to understand what are the features, because every little counts. If this building has too many design elements, if it's too overly designed, it would mean you would pay much more for any restoration works. Now, when you're buying a building, the most important, in my opinion, the most important expense is not usually the money paid to purchase the property. In my opinion, is the expenses you incur every single month. Think about this as you have income and you have expenses. If your expenses are so high, then it means that the net profit you make from the investment will be quite low. Ideally, you're trying to find a property that is beautiful, but also a property that is very, very low maintenance. It's like having a car. If you keep having to renovate, service the car regularly, suddenly you might find that the joy of having the car starts to erode. So just make reference to what I'm just explaining, because the more features the house has, although beautiful as they might be, the more you might have to pay for maintenance. And then finally, number 3 is the door. Now, you've arrived at the property. There is going to be a main door. I'm assuming here, just remember this, I'm assuming here you're buying an entire house or you are buying a flat in a house. I'm not assuming you're buying a flat in what we might call an apartment block, because most apartment blocks tend to be new built or newly built, which would mean they might be slightly different in terms of the exterior design. However, the principles still apply. But the first thing to look out for is the external door. Type. Is it wooden? Just like the windows. Is it aluminum? What is the design? Does it have, glass planes? Or is it completely of one type? Just bear that in mind, because the type of window you have will make a difference. A difference in relation to security, a difference in terms of access control. By access control, what I mean is that sometimes you have a system, an intercom system that is connected to the door from each of the flats. Some doors allow for such systems to be easily installed. Some do not. In other words, someone comes and rings the bell, you can see the person from your flat, and then you open the door, you press something, and the door releases. So just pay attention, because sometimes you might find that you're buying a house, everything looks fine, the inside is beautiful, the outside is beautiful, but it has a very, very old door. And that means the first thing you have to do is replace the door. That could set you back something in the region of about 1,500 just for the door itself. If you would like to then install an intercom or a door access system into the door system, including workmanship, in addition to the 1,500, you could be paying an extra 2,500. So easily, it could cost you about 4,000 to 6,000 just for the door. Again, this is something you must bear in mind. If you're buying the entire house, you're liable for this cost. If this is a shared house, in other words, if there are 2 flats, you're liable for half. If it's 3 flats, you're liable for a third of the cost. So the first thing is the door, the type, and especially the arrangement between the door access control and the intercom service. Now, I've talked about the wall, the front wall. This is the front of the building. This is the rear of the building. If you can, whenever you view a property, always go to the rear and look at the building from the rear. And the reason is because sometimes you would find that there is much more about the property from the rear than there is from the front. And the reason is because sometimes you might find a property where, assuming this to be the side elevation, and that's the car parked outside, and that's you having arrived, you might find that the property you're trying to buy has been extended. I covered this in the previous session. Or it could be that you're buying, apologies for that, I just had to clear my throat. It could be that you're buying a top floor flat, but from the front of the building, it looks as though you're buying an original design, but it's been extended. And that means that if you were standing at the rear and looking, you would see that there's been an extension. So it's not an original feature. I said yesterday that all spaces are not created equal. Do not assume that because you've found a property where they've given you the floor area, let's say it's 80 square meter, don't assume that all parts of that floor area are created equal. They are not. I explained yesterday and in the previous session that for period buildings, the way they were designed was that the ground floor was the most important part of the building. It would normally have the best features. The first floor would be the next important part, similar to the ground floor. And then the top floor was normally the area for the servants. And the ceiling height, the design, was not as good because originally these buildings were meant, those areas of the buildings were meant to be used by servants. Sometimes you could find a building that has a lower ground floor, and then you would have something like the kitchen. So here you might find a property where it's got a 3 meter height. This has a 3 meter height, and here you have a 2.4 meter height. Here you have beautiful sash windows, almost full height, likewise almost full height. And here you have very tiny windows. So pay attention. You could be buying this top floor flat, and all the owner has done is to extend, put what we call a dormer. And therefore, the dormer space, whilst you're inside the building, you might have the false illusion that it was originally designed that way. You have to be aware that it may have been altered. And the only way you can find out is not by looking at the floor plans, because the floor plans can be very deceptive. The floor plans that are provided by the sales agent can be very deceptive. You like to ideally go to the rear of the building and then look at the building. But when you look at the building, I'd like you to also apply the same principles that you apply to the front of the building. In other words, critique the facade, critique the condition of the external rear wall, critique the side walls, critique the new installation or the new extension, and critique any renovation works before you make a decision on whether to proceed with the investment or not. Even more importantly, just make an observation as to whether there have been roof lights added to the building. I made reference in the previous video to the fact that whenever you've done an extension or an alteration to a building, you need to ensure that the building has building approval. Planning permission. This you can very easily verify by going to the local council and checking on their website, and you'll be able to find out. You also